Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're diving into a fascinating legal drama unfolding in India. It's all about the country's brand new Digital Personal Data Protection Act. Now, this was supposed to be a landmark law, but almost the second it was passed, it got dragged right into the Supreme Court.
And that's really the million-dollar question here, isn't it? It seems kind of strange. After years of public debate and waiting for a comprehensive data protection law, a whole bunch of groups are now demanding that the highest court in the land just throw the whole thing out. So what on earth is going on?
Okay, so before we get into the big fight, let's just quickly get on the same page about what we're talking about. The Digital Personal Data Protection Act, or DPDPA for short, is basically India's first big law meant to give you control over your digital data. It lays down the rules of the road for how companies and even the government can collect, use, and handle your personal information.
But, as we're about to see, this law was basically put on trial the moment it was born. Right out of the gate, it was hit with a wave of legal challenges that questioned its very existence.
This timeline really helps paint the picture. It all kicked off back in 2017 when the Supreme Court made a historic ruling. Privacy is a fundamental right. So, fast forward 6 years to August 2023, and Parliament finally passes the DPDPA to make that right a reality. But then, almost immediately, the challenges start rolling in, and now the whole thing has been bumped up to a larger group of judges for a much closer look.
So who are the people trying to stop this law? Well, it's a mix of prominent right to information activists, a group of investigative journalists, and a national campaign focused on transparency. And here's the real kicker. They aren't just asking for a few tweaks or amendments. No, their demand is to have the entire act declared unconstitutional and scrapped completely.
And that demand really brings us to the heart of this entire conflict, which is what we're going to get into now. At its core, this is a massive clash between two really important ideas: the public's right to know what the government is doing and a person's individual right to privacy.
A lot of this fire and fury comes down to one specific part of the law, Section 44(3). And the reason it's so controversial is because this new section directly goes in and changes the old Right to Information Act, which has been the main tool for government transparency in India for almost 20 years.
So here's how the two sides see it. The petitioners, the ones challenging the law, say this new rule creates a blanket bar. They believe it will stop any personal info from being released, which would basically slam the door on public oversight and make the government less transparent. But on the other side, defenders of the law say no, this is about protecting people's privacy. They also argue it helps out government officials who are stuck making really tough legal calls about what data to release, like right then and there. All right, but the fight over transparency is just one piece of the puzzle. There's another huge concern bubbling up here, a deep-seated fear that this new law could give the government a free pass for mass surveillance.
The critics are pointing their fingers at these specific sections. They say that when you combine exemptions for law enforcement, super broad clauses for national security, and the government's power to demand info from pretty much any company, well, they argue it creates a system with too few checks and balances, a system that could easily be used to spy on citizens.
But the folks defending the law have a pretty blunt response to that. They call these fears pure speculation and imaginary, arguing that these worries just aren't based on any real-world facts.
And wow, they don't stop there. This next quote really shows you just how intense and politically charged this whole debate has become. They use the term urban Naxalite, which is a very loaded term in India used against government critics, to frame the opposition. Their argument is that these exemptions are critical for catching criminals, and that anyone opposing them is just trying to protect the bad guys.
So we've talked about transparency and surveillance, but the fight doesn't end there. Next up, another huge battleground, the press. Should journalists get a special pass from this data protection law?
The argument here, coming from groups that include investigative journalists, is pretty straightforward. They believe that without a specific exemption just for them, this law could be weaponized to scare reporters, expose their anonymous sources, and ultimately shut down important journalism.
But, again, there's a counter. The defenders say, hold on, a special pass for journalists isn't necessary. They argue that the work journalists do is already covered under a broader exemption in the law for research, so there's no need to single them out.
And then, the defenders of the law turn the tables with a really tricky, provocative question. They ask, okay, if you want an exemption for journalists, how does that work in practice? Who gets to decide who's a real journalist in the age of social media and citizen blogging? They float the idea that this could lead to a government registration system, basically challenging if the petitioners have thought through the consequences of their demand.
Okay, so we've heard the arguments, the counterarguments, the accusations. After all of that, where does this high-stakes legal battle actually stand right now? And what's next? Well, here's the play-by-play so far. The Supreme Court heard the initial arguments, but decided not to put the law on pause. So the DDPA is still in effect. But because the issues here are so important, the court has kicked the case up to a larger bench of judges. So for now, we wait. The entire future of India's data law is in their hands.
And I want to leave you with one final, very powerful quote from the source material, because it really captures the fierce conviction of those defending this law. They see this legal challenge not as a genuine debate, but as an attempt by what they call pseudo-public interest champions to mislead the court and kill a crucial law.
And really, this whole thing boils down to this one massive, incredibly difficult question. This isn't just a legal fight happening in India. This is a mirror of the challenge that every single modern society is dealing with right now. How do you balance the public's right to know, our individual right to be left alone, and the state's need for security? That's the billion-dollar question that India, and frankly the rest of the world, is still trying to answer.